The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm your host, Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world. It's become almost journalistic cliché to suggest that Lebanon maintains its partying mindset in the harshest conditions or amid the sharpest risks. But our correspondent says that carefree attitude has slipped as a regional war reaches Lebanon's doorstep. And that old saying, quit while you're ahead, it's not much help to executive types who are ahead on paychecks and parking spots and piles of interesting problems to solve. Our columnist weighs in on how to judge just when to check out. But first,
when I say Harris, y'all say Walz. Harris.
at a rally in Philadelphia last night, the mood was raucous. The guest of honor, of course, was the Democratic presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. But everybody was there to get to know one man in particular.
Since the day that I announced my candidacy, I set out to find a partner who can help build this brighter future. I found such a leader. Governor Tim Walz of the great state of Minnesota.
In America, vice presidential picks often have a way of thrusting lesser-known politicians into a glaring spotlight. Governor Walz has his strengths and, perhaps unwittingly, coined one of the pithier attack lines in this campaign, on show again last night.
I just have to say it. You know it, you feel it. These guys are creepy and, yes, just weird as hell. That's what you see. That's what you see.
Like Ms. Harris herself, Mr. Walz has to get up to speed quickly to make clear what he adds to the ticket, to fend off the attack lines that are sure to come from Republicans in return, to add whatever he can to the eventual Democratic vote tally, which historically isn't a whole lot. But this will, again, be a presidential election in which not a whole lot can make all the difference.
I think Tim Walz is a good pick.
John Prideaux is our United States editor.
It's not a huge surprise in that he was on a quite short shortlist. That shortlist included Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky, Josh Shapiro, Governor of Pennsylvania, Mark Kelly, a senator from Arizona, and Walz. So, he had a 1 in 4 chance and seemed to be gaining momentum before the pick.
So let's learn a little bit, I think, as much of the world is about this guy. Who is he? What's he done? How did he get where he is?
Well, he's got a pretty interesting CV. He was born in rural Nebraska in 1964. He's a smidgen older than his running mate, Kamala Harris. He was a high school teacher in rural Minnesota and a high school football coach. And he only got into politics as an elected official in his 40s. That's a bit unusual these days in a country where often people get involved in politics in their 20s or in their 30s. So he's a latecomer, and that's quite useful, I think. He also served in the Air National Guard for 24 years, and he's a keen hunter, doesn't drink alcohol. In terms of relevant government experience, he was in Congress where he represented a rural district for Minnesota for about a decade. And since 2019, he's been governor of the state of Minnesota.
And so why do you think Kamala Harris chose him from that short list?
Well, I think there are some good reasons for picking him and some less good ones. So start with the good ones. I think he balances the ticket in a way that is strategically smart. So Harris is a coastal Californian lawyer, sort of elite background. Walz is different to that. He's not a lawyer, unlike Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, who is probably the favorite, or unlike J.D. Vance. He has a more normal dad vibe, if you like. And I think in a party that has been losing support among working class Democrats, that's helpful. He's also folksy and gives a good speech, so he brings some real assets to the ticket. The less good reason for picking him, I would say, is that he became the favoured candidate of the online left and of unions. And if the pick is a sign that the Harris campaign thinks it can win by just stroking the base and enthusing Democratic-affiliated teachers' unions, I think that would be a mistake. However, we don't know that that's what's happened here, and for the time being, I think we should keep an open mind.
So what do you mean, then, that would be stroking the base? Why is he a favorite of the left?
Well, it's not completely obvious why, Jason. If you look at his record in Congress, he was not one of the more left-wing congressmen. In fact, quite the opposite. He was moderate. As governor of Minnesota, he's governed as a pretty regular Democrat. He hasn't done anything hugely lefty. And actually, within Minnesota politics, he's perceived as being not on the left of the party. But what I think's going on here, really, is that activists often love it when a politician comes along who they think is on their side and they think can win without having to make too much or any ideological compromises. So I think they're projecting quite a lot onto Walz that might not actually be there. And one of the reasons they do that, I think, is because he spent a long time as a public school teacher, geography teacher, and that's about as democratic a profession as it's possible to get.
But part of the calculation here surely also is what happens on the electoral map, right?
Yes, that's right. So we have a duty to underline that the vice presidential pick doesn't typically determine the outcome of the election. I mean, that's an understatement. There's not a lot of evidence that it makes a huge difference to who wins. That said, the pick does tell you something about the Harris campaign strategy. And Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, was the narrow favorite for this position. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, he's impressive and is a good speaker also, and so on. But more than that, Pennsylvania is most likely to be the state that determines this election, the swingiest of the swing states, if you like. In the past couple of cycles, in 2020 and 2016, it was incredibly close in Pennsylvania. And if having the state's governor on the ticket wins you, a percentage point in vote share, that is a huge deal in Pennsylvania. So choosing Walz instead of Shapiro is, in a way, the non-obvious choice for the campaign. It's a more obvious choice from the point of view of party unity and balancing the ticket.
And what do you think the Trump campaign makes of this pick? What do you foresee in terms of attack lines or changes in TAC in general?
Well, they've taken the glee of the left of the Democratic Party at this pick and run with it and accused Walz of being radical, tried rather implausibly to describe him as another San Francisco liberal like Harris. He's really not, but that's the attack line they will use, that he's way to the left, he's too radical for America, and so on. The other thing that I think you'll start hearing in terms of attack lines is that he waited to call out the National Guard after George Floyd's murder. I think he only waited a day or so, but still that will be used against him. And during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, there was a fraud on the Department of Education in Minnesota. And as governor of the state, he's in overall charge of that. To be clear, he's not implicated in any fraud himself, but the reporting of this at the time suggested that he was a little slow to act on it and reluctant to acknowledge the problem. So it's that size of problem rather than a real scandal, I'd say.
And so here's a question I'll be asking you again and again as we get closer and closer to Election Day, but what do the polls look like at this moment then, just after this pick?
At the moment, in our polling average, Harris is a couple of points ahead of Donald Trump. And that is quite a big change, Jason, because ever since October, the Democratic candidate, then Joe Biden, has been running behind Donald Trump. So this is the first time this year that Harris has been ahead. But as you well know, this is not an election that is decided by the national popular vote. It's an election that's decided in the Electoral College. And because the key swing states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin in particular, are a little bit to the right of the nation as a whole, I think Harris is still behind in the Electoral College. It's hard to know for sure, but that's what I think, and that's what lots of my colleagues here at The Economist think. So it's not time for the Harris campaign to bring out the Diet Mountain Dew and celebrate. This is still an extremely close race.
At the mention of your colleagues at The Economist, I wonder which part of this you are going to laser focus on in checks and balance.
We're going to be talking about suburban voters this week, but we will also be talking about the vice presidential pick and chewing over what difference he might make to the race and what my colleagues Idris and Charlotte think of him. So looking forward to that. And then, Jason, I also have to advertise in coming attractions. This week is the final episode of Boom, the generation that blew up American politics, the podcast series I've been working on for a couple of months. And it's focused on 2020, which is a year that explains a great deal of what's happening in American politics now, not least why Kamala Harris is currently the Democratic nominee.
I will be tuning in. John, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Jason.
Did you know that print and digital subscribers to The Economist can listen to The Intelligence and all of our audio journalism, including Checks and Balance and Boom! Ad-free in our app? Just one more reason to subscribe. For those who haven't, well, here comes an ad. For more than 300 days, Israel and Hezbollah have kept their conflict at Lebanon's southern border at a low simmer, aiming for military targets or evacuated border towns. Hezbollah has fired thousands of projectiles at Israel since the start of the war in Gaza, in solidarity with Hamas. But on July 27th, something changed with those calculated potshots. A rocket hit a football ground in Israel-occupied Golan Heights, killing a dozen children. It looks like it was a mistake, but it has changed the tenor of the conflict and in the mood in the whole of Lebanon, most recently with the assassination of a Hezbollah commander in Beirut. Something bigger seems inevitable, and America, Britain, Australia, France, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Turkey, Jordan, all have told their citizens to get out.
I'm in the Lebanese capital, Beirut. I've been here for the past 3 weeks.
Gareth Brown writes about the Middle East for The Economist.
I've been travelling up and down the country, all the way down to the southern border, trying to get a feel for the country, which does seem to be on the precipice of a wider, greater conflict.
And so, broadly, what is the feel in Lebanon?
I think Beirut has this reputation for being this sort of party city, regardless of conflict, regardless of political instability. But I would say in the last few days, I've seen cracks in that reputation. There's a sense of nervousness, apprehension. I wouldn't say we're in full-blown panic, but there's a definite change in the atmosphere, and that's come in the context of these regional tensions, the Israeli assassinations in Tehran and Beirut, the war in Gaza, which has now been going for 10 months, and indeed a conflict in South Lebanon where nearly 100,000 Lebanese people have been displaced from their homes. Hundreds of Lebanese people have been killed. Despite all this apprehension, life goes on. And I think that was clear just a few weeks ago, before the two assassinations by Israel, when the Festival of Ashura took place. And I went to the procession in a Hezbollah stronghold. They have a huge Shia population. The crowds were huge, bigger than in previous years, despite the evident risks. That is the sound of Ashura, one of the most important religious festivals in Shia Islam. And it's taking place this year in Dahia, in the southern suburbs of Beirut, under heightened regional tensions. I've just entered the Dahia after very stringent security checks, and despite the risks, there's thousands of people here. A sea of flags, people handing out food, coffee, sweets. There was no guarantee it was a safe sort of festival to be at. You saw an element of people trying to get on with their lives, but I think that becomes increasingly difficult as the regional context changes and develops.
Well, most sharply changing, I suppose, with the strike that actually happened in Beirut. Can you tell us more about that and what people expect Hezbollah to do?
So the strike that happened in Beirut took out Fouad Shukr, and he is a senior Hezbollah military commander. It came in response to a strike in the occupied Golan Heights. Now, this is part of Syria, which Israel occupies, and it has a significant Druze population. A rocket was fired from Lebanon and hit a soccer field and killed 12 Druze children. Israel blamed that rocket strike on Hezbollah. Hezbollah have denied it. It was certain after that there would be a serious response to that strike, those 12 dead children. And that came initially in the form of the assassination of Fuad Shukr, this Hezbollah commander in South Beirut. That was followed a few hours later with the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, who was the leader of Hamas, who was in Tehran. So these twin assassinations are the context in which we see these rising tensions. And I think many Lebanese would say this is a regional game, but actually, in particular, South Beirut, South Lebanon are ground zero for this conflict in many ways and are going to be ground zero if this conflict continues to escalate.
And on the matter of escalation, then, what efforts are there to keep things from escalating amid all this talk of wider regional war?
There are several channels of communication. The main one is the US channel. And a lot of those efforts to de-escalate the situation in South Lebanon relate back to a UN Security Council resolution 1701, which was actually the resolution which brought about the end of the last war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. And part of that UN mandate is there's many thousand UN peacekeepers positioned in the south of Lebanon. Their role is something of a referee or an observer, effectively acting as a buffer between Israel and Hezbollah, which has significant strength in the south of Lebanon. I've been spending time with the UN peacekeepers. It's so dangerous in the south. To be honest, the only way you can really move around is with UN peacekeepers in their vehicles. So I'm standing on the edge of a crater in the village of Yarin. Clearly an airstrike. Must be nearly 10 meters deep, 15 meters wide. It's very, very dangerous to move around on your own in a private car. And these areas sort of close to the border have been abandoned. They're empty villages, they're ghost towns. Now, for the first time today, I can actually hear a drone in the sky above. I can't see it.
Yeah, now it's normal. Yeah.
What worries you more, the drones or the silence?
When there is the drone,
yeah.
It's normal. When there isn't, it's not good. When there isn't drone, it's not good because can happen an event. Yeah.
And I think once you get to the south, once you spend time with the UN peacekeepers, you can see that actually this war has already started. You see destroyed buildings, airstrike craters. This is a war that's already begun in the south.
So you say that the UN troops are mere referees, observers, but still they are planted in the middle of what you're describing as an active war zone. What was that like for you and for them?
I was with a patrol for about 5 hours. It's eerie and quiet. You know, there was just one instance right at the end of our trip where we heard some outgoing fire from Lebanon into Israel. And not far in the distance is the Israeli city of Haifa. I can see it clearly. It's remarkably close. Remarkably close. What happened there? What was that?
It was the sound of the launches.
That was something launched from Lebanon into Israel?
Yep, probably.
But I think it's more unnerving to hear the calm, the silence. It makes your imagination sort of go into overdrive about what's coming next. You can see the rubble, you can see the devastation, but you can't hear or see the fighting. And in an instant, that can change when you're heading for cover, jumping into your armored vehicle. It's very fragile. We know we're in the eye of the storm right now. We're in a period of silence, and we know that silence is going to be shattered when Iran and Hezbollah respond to the assassinations. We don't know when that's going to happen. We don't know how bad it's going to be. We don't know what they're going to do. But we know that moment is coming.
Gareth, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Deciding when to quit is relatively simple early on in a career.
Andrew Palmer, no relation, is our Britain editor and writes Bartleby, our column on work and management.
If the prospect of going into work on a Monday morning is more depressing than a Lars von Trier film, then it is time to leave. If you've got nothing left to learn in your current job, then you should probably grab the opportunity to go elsewhere. But it's much less easy to quit a job when you're in a role where you've got lots of status, where the money is rolling in, where there's lots of challenges and stimulation.
To choose an example from recent history, like, for example, the American presidency.
Yes, you're right, Jason. That is a good example. Lots of power, lots of novelty, lots of purpose. But what's true of American presidents and politicians elsewhere is also true of chief executives and senior business figures. So moving on is particularly difficult if you're in a top job, and even more so if it's the last big job that you're likely to have.
Which I guess we see a lot of when it comes to the current captains of industry.
So there are a few examples of that. So Bob Iger at Disney has made not leaving into a kind of art form, contract extensions, leaving the job and then coming back. He has been there for an awfully long time. And similarly with Jamie Dimon, the boss of JP Morgan Chase, the surest way to know that you're not going to succeed him is to be appointed his successor. So both of these bosses have been around for a very long time. There's been a lot of talk about how long they will stay in their jobs. The thing about them is that they are actual stars. They do have a track record which at least justifies some of that longevity. That's not the case for others.
Half-hour Boeing naming a new CEO. Finally, Phil LeBeau.
So Dave Calhoun at Boeing presided over this really big period of reputational damage, which was related to safety concerns at the aircraft maker. And originally it looked like he was going to hold on to his position right until the end of this year, but he will now be replaced on August the 8th.
So what's the psychology here? Why is it that these bosses hang on to power even if the flying isn't so smooth?
Well, flying, funny you should mention that. Private jets probably are one incentive to stay. There are very material incentives if you're right at the top of a big organization that are difficult to give up. Personal assistance, you don't have to worry about your calendar or your diary, you've got chauffeurs, etc., etc. All of that is rather nice and hard to give up. There's a psychological element to this too. People who tend to reach the tops of organizations have healthy egos, often a dose of narcissism, and they believe that they can do the job well and better than other people. So the idea of adjusting to other people doing the job well is difficult. And then there's just the change of pace and interest. If 1 week you're at Davos hobnobbing with movers and shakers, and the next you're at home and you're doing a strategic review of the spice rack, that is not a particularly exciting prospect.
But somewhere deep down, you know that your time's got to come up at some point. How should high-flying bosses make that choice? When is it time to go?
So that's a really hard question to answer. There's some research which helps. So there's a study by Francois Brochet of Boston University and his co-authors who looked at the relationship between CEO tenure and firm value. So basically how long a boss is in charge and how well the firm is doing. What they conclude is that firm values started to decline on average after a CEO had been in the job for 14 years. Now that's not massively helpful because that number is going to vary hugely between different executives, firms, and industries. But what's more useful about that research is that it shows a hump shape in performance. So you see CEOs as they enter a job, they take a little while to get up to speed, to understand exactly what's required of it. Then their success plateaus, and at some point it starts to die off. And we see that not just in business context, we've seen that in other places too, from college basketball to Hollywood, where film studio bosses also seem to display that pattern.
But we've heard examples already of bosses who pay no mind to the hump anyway. Surely this is a decision to be made by boards and not by the bosses themselves.
Yeah, boards are the constraint on bosses. Independent boards making independent decisions is absolutely the right governance mechanism for this. They could start to impose constraints on bosses by getting them to retire at a fixed age or even imposing term limits on them. But there is a downside to boards enforcing rigid terms of office or mandatory retirement ages. One is that a boss may just be hitting his or her stride. Things may be going extremely well, just at the point when they're asked to leave. The other is that bosses change their behaviour when they know that their career horizons are short in the jargon. So there's research out there to show that a CEO who knows that they're about to go tends to generate fewer big innovations or is more likely to accept takeover bids. So there's some balance to be struck here between being aware that bosses have a natural shelf life and not being too rigid in the way that one tries to avoid people clinging on. And perhaps the best way to do that is to test for self-awareness on the part of a boss early on. So one of the first things you might ask someone who's looking for a position at the top of an organization is, how long do you think you should be in the job?
Andrew, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Jason.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. We'll see you back here tomorrow.